It is going down tonight live on Your Voice, Your Future. We have an all-star panel starring Marcia Jackson in studio. Sam Faddis is in the house. Robert Patillo is in the house. And of course, Sam Faddis, let me tell you why I'm so excited. I got excited. Marcia Dyson, what did I call you?
Jackson, like I'm part of the Jackson 5. That's okay, as long as I can get some of the royalties.
You know,
call me what you want.
Jackson's
Rhythm Nation.
It's Marcia Jackson.
No, right. You. Royalties, I'm part of the Jackson 5.
Okay, but anyhow, you know it's all out of love. Okay?
I know, it's okay.
But anyhow, Sam Faddis, Robert Patillo has me psyched tonight. Because I thought about this. I read Sam Faddis's article today at A&D, and the title was Communists on Campus. Did I get that right, Sam?
You did, sir. That's the exact title.
And you're referring to New Orleans.
Well, I was using New Orleans as a point of departure because these folks from this legal guild showed up there, and apparently to provide sort of on-site immediate legal counsel to pro-Palestinian, quote-unquote, protesters. And we sort of dove into who these guys from this legal guild are and how they go back to the 1930s. And they are originally a pro-Soviet organization that wants to create a communist state in the United States of America, and they've never gone away. So whatever the agenda of the average 18-year-old is that's smoking a joint and sitting out in the encampment, the folks behind this know exactly what they're about, and it doesn't have much of anything to do with stopping genocide. It has to do with destroying the United States of America.
So you think this is what we're seeing at Columbia, at Yale, at Harvard, at MIT, and all across the country in Princeton?
Yeah, I do. Again, you know, as a point of emphasis, you got 500 boys and girls sitting around in Harvard Yard or wherever. I suspect most of them have, at best, only the haziest notion of what it is they're protesting and what they're doing and what this is all about, right? I mean, we get it. They're college kids. But the folks who are behind this, who are organizing it, and it is organized coast to coast, have a very, very radical agenda. Again, looking at this Lawyers Guild. Look, these guys are as hardcore as you can get. And by the way, they were helping Black Lives Matter folks, Antifa folks. This is just the latest face they've put on this effort. These guys have made common cause with North Korea. They've made common cause with Palestinian terrorist groups. They've made common cause with the Iranian Ayatollahs. These guys are about as hardcore as you could get and completely out of the American mainstream. And this is just another opportunity for them to try to tear down the system.
So what is that success and failure rate when you look over history?
Well, look, these are guys who literally in the 1930s were pro-Soviet Union. These are guys who made common cause with the Weathermen and SDS, the 60s and 70s. For them, this is about the revolution, and I mean that in the most literal sense. All you got to do is listen to them. They're talking about destroying the existing political, socialist, economic order. Have they achieved their objective yet? No, but they're still out there, they're still doing it. And I mean, when you look at what's happening right now, the fact that this Lawyers Guild and associated groups, there are lots of other groups associated with them, can organize coast to coast, not just on college campuses, but block bridges and shut down airports. I mean, in other words, this is not just 12 old hippies sitting around somewhere dreaming about what could have been. These guys are serious, and they've obviously got a lot of money behind them.
Where's the money coming from?
It comes from a whole host of non-governmental organizations, NGOs. So, I mean, everybody wants to turn this into Soros is funding this. Soros has his hands in this, but it is a lot broader and a lot more complicated than that. What we have are groups like, for instance, the Tides Foundation, that have been endowed with huge amounts of money, often coming originally from major American corporations, and now gets funneled into these kind of efforts. I mean, one of the biggest funders of Black Lives Matter during the so-called Summer of Love, right, was the Ford Foundation, right? I mean, one of the most, like, I mean, it's now, it operates independently from Ford Motor Company at the present time. So let's just be clear on that. But the point is, the point of origin of the Ford Foundation is one of the most iconic American corporations you can think of. And now that foundation funds groups that want to tear down the American system.
Marcia, I saw you shaking your head a few times. Do you think that these kids are useful tools for a larger diabolical agenda, as Sam saying, who's ran the weapons of mass destruction program for the CIA for many, many years?
I listened to Sam, and he has some very good points, but in interacting with college students myself in various unrest that we had across the nation, whether it's Black Lives Matters, you're definitely on point. I told another guest that'll be on the show lately that Black Lives Matter was about black and blue contestation, but if you go into the city of Chicago, where you had black on black, and I wasn't allowed to say it, but we were murdering one another, then that Black Lives Matter did not show up on the south side or west sides of Chicago. But now the young people found that out, and you got in New York City, Tamika Mallory and Mason General, who are actually going knocking on doors saying that we have to stop black on black murder. So anytime when you have those kind of unrest, even though they're infiltrated, there are some bright students. I mean, I come from the 60s, right? And people would have considered me radical. But there were some things happening within our city that we protested as university students. And some of them communist-driven, not the organizations that I was in. But if you read a book called The Color of Communism that was written several decades ago, it talks about the infiltration of the Communist Party with the historic organizations, the NAACP. I mean, Robinson was even fooled, and I'm quite sure, all these black agencies who thought they couldn't get compassion from white America went toward the persons or the entities that were still white that they thought that were comrades and would help them out of their struggle. But this is one thing I say, since it's situated in a very dire, uncompromising point, is if these students are bringing attention to the genocide. I kind of take offense over saying that it is the Israeli war, right? No, it is genocide. And can they be infiltrated? Yes, they're not that orderly, but when it comes to some of the students are honest. When you talk about the students from the Ivy League school, right? One young woman on her Instagram account says, look, we're not talking about unprivileged people. These are children, a lot like in any voting electional period. They come up and say, we want to end the imperialism that we know that our fathers and our mothers are creating, and we don't want to be held accountable for it. Just like some of the Jews for Peace are saying, Armstrong, we don't want to be accountable for what Zionist Jews are doing in our country and saying that they represent us. They don't. So I don't think it's all straightforward. Whether there's communist infiltration or not, that might be a part of it, but it's not all of it. I think that one reason why a lot of the students are showing up, because we refuse to have a Congress to be just, right? We see them being quite hypocritical, saying one thing and doing another thing immediately. And sometimes, you are educated, so you say, 1 + 1 is not 3, and that's what they're making it think. So I think it's a collaboration or a combination of many factors. Yes, maybe now the infiltration, because we allowed that. I mean, our government allowed for this infiltration. Our government and certain leaders who didn't show up allowed this unrest within the student population, whereas if they had been responsible and honest, then maybe they wouldn't have this situation as it is now, with the possibility and always more than likely some infiltration from outside force that want to destroy our so-called understanding of what a democracy is. And yes, okay, all right, I'm Janet Jackson.
Oh, no, I was talking to
No, okay, I thought you, okay.
Just in my ear trying to tell me
all
what
right.
to do. Laura Patillo, your thoughts on what you're hearing?
You know, I'm trying to understand the exact positioning of the political dynamic in this country. For the past year, we've had conservatives saying they don't want to have a single penny of U.S. taxpayers' dollars spent on foreign aid to other governments. These students are saying we don't want taxpayer dollars funding Israel and foreign governments. We've had Republicans telling us for the last 4 years that they would trust Vladimir Putin more than Joe Biden. Now we're hearing that these students are being infiltrated by Russians and Soviets and communists who conservatives have been telling us that we should be trusting in the form of Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent. You have this idea that they're aligning themselves with Kim Jong-un, but also Donald Trump taking credit for opening up relations with Kim Jong-un and saying that he's not that bad of a guy. The political lines in America are very much skewed right now. And all these students who are protesting are doing it in such a way that is hurting Joe Biden's opportunity at re-election, but it's supposed to be some kind of left-wing plot that is organizing these things and left-wing money behind it. The entire thing doesn't make sense. And I'm assuming I'm the only person on the panel who's actually been expelled from college for being a student activist and organizing rallies on college campus. And I can tell you, these kids don't have to be infiltrated. They don't have to be somehow brainwashed and told that they're part of a bigger scheme. They see what is going on internationally. They want to be part of the change. This is part of the American tradition. Students protested the global war on terror of the Iraq War 20 years ago. Students protested at Kent State and the Vietnam War 50 years ago. There were protests during the draft in the North during the Civil War of people who did not want to go and fight in the South who went to Ivy League schools. During the Revolutionary War, there were students at Ivy League universities and institutes of higher education who did not want to break away from the British Empire and who protested the war that we were in then. The American story is a story of protest against oppressive regimes, and the idea that somehow you need a communist plot to get 19 and 20-year-olds to stand up to change the world is not within the historical nature of America. We should be supporting these young people and seeing that they are using their political power and their strength to change American policies. And if the grown-ups would actually take that, maybe we can get rid of some of this gridlock in Congress.
I agree.
Of course you agree.
No, I do agree because look, in 1969.
Wait, before you get on your tantrum, let me go to a break.
Okay.
We'll come back. We're going to
right.
mix this up. Your voice, your future. We'll be back. You know, we get all the points from Marcia and Rob, but particularly about there have always been protests in America. America certainly has not been a fair broker, particularly when you look at the history and what many Americans have endured in this country. But I think Sam is saying something, and I don't want to get so caught up in supporting the protesters. The question, though, supporting the protesters at what price? I just think it's just a matter of time before you begin to see real violence, real vandalism, and real destruction. I think this is where this is leading. I mean, these protests, Sam, are so similar to every other protest around the country and in Europe. They look the same. Obviously, the same people are organizing and calling the shots. Do we really understand what their arterial agenda is and at what price?
Well, I think we do if we are willing to discuss it. Again, you know, for the record, I'm not against protest. I am not against American citizens having the right to stand up and oppose their government. Frankly, I think we ought to do a heck of a lot more of that. And I am not accusing every one of these kids sitting around of being a communist by any stretch of the imagination. I think they're doing what they think is right, but there's a lot getting lost in the shuffle. I mean, one of the things getting lost here is this immediate struggle we're involved in here involves the Israelis against Hamas. Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization that engages in mass murder and uses rape as a weapon of war. Those are facts, and that didn't start in the fall of last year. That has been true for a very long time. Is that me saying that all the 2 million plus people that live in the Gaza Strip who are stuck in the middle of this are all terrorists? Absolutely not. But the fact of the matter is that Hamas has been in control of Gaza, and Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization. We cannot possibly reasonably debate that or say, well, it's okay for them to machine gun kids at a music festival because they're being oppressed. It is also true, as you just pointed out, there are very large organizations here, Students for Justice of Palestine, within our lifetime, which is basically the New York branch of Students for Justice in Palestine. We could go on. These organizations have a very broad, long-standing agenda. They are utilizing this current conflict to push that. What I'm saying is, yeah, you got 300 kids sitting around a college campus, and they all think they're doing the right thing, and they are certainly exercised. As long as they're peaceful, within bounds, and following the law, they're doing what Americans should do. But that doesn't answer the question of who's pulling the strings here and utilizing them. And again, if you look at the express agenda of people like the National Lawyers Guild, you don't have to read between the lines. They've been saying for decades they want to tear down the existing system. And that doesn't mean more equity, equality, or all these things that I think all of us could agree. They want to destroy the free enterprise capitalist system, straight up. They want to get rid of a democracy and replace it with a totalitarian communist regime. We could go on down the list. So again, does that mean every kid that's sitting around the campus in Columbia is guilty of these things? By no means. But this is an orchestrated, organized phenomenon, and it has a much deeper, much broader agenda.
Marcia?
I want to say any terrorist group, whether it's the Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, Boko Haram, or even the IDF, are extreme groups.
Do you think the IDF is a terrorist group?
I don't have to
Do you believe that?
I absolutely
So
do.
the American military, the CIA is a terrorist group.
Well, you have to ask some other countries.
No, I'm asking you if you can say the IDF, that means the CIA
Well,
is a terrorist group.
It's not about just me saying it. Let's look at, he wanted to say about actions. When looking at the Gaza Strip and you talk about Hamas, Israel has one of the greatest surveillance technology in the world, we are told, right? And the fact that you can kill over 30, almost 40,000 people, and you don't think that that is criminal, Sam? And yes, rape as a woman, absolutely, rape is horrifying, but it's also happened on the other side too, that there are accounts equally, if not more so, with some of the soldiers and some of their antics as well. What we're talking about is all very ugly, but when you talk about the students and infiltration, and we talk about saving the democracy of America, well, you have to look toward our leadership. And when you talk about infiltrated, right? You got to look at some of the congressmen who actually lost their seats because they didn't take money from a certain organization, because most of our congressmen have been infiltrated by this group by taking certain money from a particular organization. So that's a form of infiltration which stops our democracy as well. When you cannot say certain words like, 6 letters, and then you're going to say that that's criminalized and saying that's anti-Semitic. Well, here's a scoop for you. People in a certain region, that's not an ethnicity. It's based upon your linguistics as well as your geographical genesis. And so most of the people in that region are Semitic. Palestinians are Semitic, some Ethiopians are Semitic. And so it's not just, you can't say it that it relates to just one group. That is not even correct in saying it. So when it comes to the infiltration of students, everything, when it comes down to student level and getting engagement, then you can get more information, you can get more engagement, and you can have the kind of conversations that we're having. Now, you're talking about Columbia University. and per se, but what about the professors that have been handcuffed, wanting to make sure that the students understand what is going on? So it's not like they're operating. Yes,
they're
have you
part
seen
of the problem.
That's what you say.
Are you kidding me?
That's what you say. But it's not either or. But there's another bigger problem. What is really problem is the fault line of hypocrisy in America that to me is the real genesis. For me, if you want to play
so they just destroy America. Is
well, I'm not saying no. We're not. They're not destroying America. I'm not going to even say we. I'm going to say our political leaders are instrumental in destroying America. When you allow
it's people who've infiltrated our country that wants to destroy America.
You act like our Congress are not people. They're people
I'm not
too.
going to compare members of Congress to terrorists.
I'm not going to say all of them. I'm not calling them terrorists.
I may not agree with them, but they're not trying to bring about the destruction of America.
I'm not saying they're not terrorists, but what's the First Amendment? When anybody not allows somebody for free speech, I'm talking about the fabric of it. I'm not in the boardroom or the hidden rooms. I'm talking about the fabric of America. And the first thing, if anyone does not have free speech, whether on the college campus or in the Congress or anywhere.
The problem is they have too much free speech. But let's go to Robert.
Okay.
That's part of the problem. Free speech is one thing. Saying the death to Israel and the death to America,
death to genocide. You're right. Robert, I agree with that. Death to anybody.
Yes.
Death to anybody.
That goes against the code of conduct.
Death to anybody.
Death to anybody.
Okay, then that's equal.
Yes.
But that's not what we're hearing on the Hill.
Robert, your input.
Well, look, this is the issue that I have with this. That it seems that the communist line has always been the very easy boogeyman to throw out there to not address the underlying issues that people are talking about. The 1960s, we said the entire civil rights movement were communist. Even Nina Simone in her song Mississippi Goddamn, she said they think it's all just a communist plot. We talk about Paul Robeson and many other civil rights leaders who were nearly chased out of the country because of quote unquote being associated with the Communist Party. And guess what? It wasn't about communism. It was about the Civil Rights Act of '64. Voting rights in '65, public accommodation, fair housing. It was a movement that was about uplifting and actually bringing about the true meaning behind Reconstruction and what we constitutionally promised to people in this nation. It was about women's rights. It was about farm workers' rights. It was about Latino rights. And that's what was the 1960s. It wasn't about communism, but at the time, they could use that as a justification to kill Fred Hampton. At the time, they could use it as a reason to infiltrate the Black Panthers. At the time, they could use it as a reason to blackmail Martin Luther King. So anytime they want to create a boogeyman in America, all they have to do is paint it with the idea of communism. But if it makes people feel better, those same students in the 1960s, those white liberal students on Berkeley's campus, on Kent State campus, 20 years later, they were Reagan revolutionaries and conservative.
But the issue with this conversation, we're not addressing the threat that's infiltrating our country. I mean, you want to go back to the past. Everybody got a wound from America's history, not just black people. Everybody has something to complain about. But today, when these bombs and these terrorist attackers, they're not going to think about your race and your background, your history. We all are vulnerable. What about that?
Well, we are vulnerable. On the college campuses, it's not just one group of people. If anything, there has been global and American in the last year is what these students are doing. And not only, and like I said, it's not so much that they're for Hamas, that is not it, but the narrative has been side-swapped or stolen. A lot of these students, and I have students who are in the mix of this, right? I won't say who they are, but on the various college campuses, I know that they're peaceful warriors. They're there to bring attention to genocide. Yes, they're also bringing attention to the rape on both sides, and they also they're tied with Jewish students as well who make confessions as to what they have been basically groomed to respond to. And you know, you said, it's not Sam, but the other gentleman, in 1969, I was at the University of Illinois when Fred Hampton was killed right down the street. And I was one of those students with a cadre of diverse students protesting the murder of Fred Hampton for the very reasons that you
Robert,
said.
Did you finish your point?
The point that I'm making is you can use Occam's razor around this. These students who are protesting started protesting around the time that Israel started not just the offensive into Gaza, but actually the wide-scale killing of civilians, the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of
Hamas on October 7th? What about Hamas?
Hold on.
What is going on here? Is this revisionist history?
Armstrong, this is not revisionist history, because the fact is, if America stopped supplying weapons and are using our taxpayers' money to provide bombs to kill children and civilians, the protest would end. So if we're saying that it's
You
a communist
actually think
revolution,
Hamas
then
will
in theory
stop?
the
If
protest.
America does all those things, Hamas will just lay down and say, leave in peace. Sam, let me get the last word before we, because I just a lot to consume you today. I'm just
You need to educate it.
Go ahead, Sam.
Well, look, there are a lot of allegations here of genocide and bombing of hospitals and so forth. I don't know any of that to be true. And I should say, by the way, I've dealt with the Israelis for many years, and I will guarantee you that if you ask the guys that I dealt with about their interaction with me, I was not their lapdog, and I was not buying their propaganda. They probably thought I was a pain in the butt most of the time because I was looking out for the interests of the United States. But it amazes me, honestly, with all due respect to your guests, that all of a sudden we're talking about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and I don't know what else. And what we're not talking about is that this is about Hamas launching an attack into Israel, killing at least 1,200 Israeli citizens, raping women literally to death, machine gunning kids at a music concert. By the way, you don't have to buy the Israelis' narrative for any of this because Hamas put video of all of this up on the internet because they're really proud of parading dead bodies and showing how brave they were killing kids. So all of a sudden, actions, however, whatever the kids think they're doing on a college campus, those actions in support of that are being equated to what I think of as American heroes, right? Folks from the civil rights movement who engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience and brought down a clearly racist structure in the United States of America. I don't know how we get to this equivalence.
Well, anyhow. No. I'm sorry, Robert. We're out of time. I'm going to say goodbye to you and Sam because we're going to come back with Marcia and Manaigo. We got to talk about the diaspora. But thank you both for such a necessary conversation. We will continue to have these conversations.
But we have to say we're not for terrorism, Sam, on any level, and that's not the real conversation.
Well, let's put it like this. We should all be Americans today, not focusing on what America
We should all be
has done.
compassionate.
We should talk about the potential of America and saving these young people from being co-opted by their professors and indoctrinated, and they have no idea
undermined
what they're
by their
protesting.
leadership.
Yeah, but anyhow, we'll be back. Don't go away.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence, there's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. Why is it that the mainstream media, the international press, does not talk about the wars that are going on in the DRC and what's happening in Rwanda, with Tishkakita. I mean, nothing. I mean, there's, you know, a genocide.
Yes, you're right.
Why? Aaron.
Well, it's...
And why don't you tell us exactly what goes on there that is so it's not even reported?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Williams, I think even more front and center is what's going on in the Sahel region, more recent in Africa, where you talk about what's going on in Mali, what's going on in Burkina Faso, you know, what's going on in Niger, as far as those takeovers in those countries. Some will call them coups taking place there. Some will call it, you know, revolutions to reform the country. But more to your point, there's devastation, there's chaos, there's uncertainty. And whenever you have those factors emanating from any country or any region, what you have is the destabilizing of a region. And it is certainly not in the United States' interest to have a destabilized Western or Southern portion of Africa going into tumult.
Another thing, too, before we get Marcia in on the conversation, some of these countries don't even have standing militaries anymore. They're using mercenaries from Russia, from Belgium, and other places.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. We certainly saw what was going on with the Wagner group out of Russia. They were certainly making their presence felt. After the demise of their leader, you started to see somewhat of a pullback of the other Wagner group, spreading its tentacles throughout the continent. But nevertheless, we see now Russia filling the void of Russia itself, filling the void, sending military arms, equipment, and other supplies over to Niger, Mali, the Sahel regions. And they are saying essentially that, you know, power hates a vacuum, and we're going to fill that vacuum. And the U.S., since we don't have a real comprehensive policy or framework on Africa, this is happening right in front of our noses.
Why, Marcia?
I think that he's the authority, given his position on it. But with all of my travels on the continent of Africa and interacting with a lot of the African leadership and the invisibility of what was going on, especially even Congo, right now. You look at Congo, you look at Sudan, you look at Somalia, you can even look at Ethiopia in some forms of fashion, that there's also unrest as well as to the destabilization of the country based upon some of our policies as well as our international with the business community that comes from the United States, right? But, and specifically, since you're talking about Russian infiltration, is where there's no sense of power, then you're going to bring in someone to whom you may feel you have an alliance, which is Russia. Even Mandela, right? And Arafat, when people were asking him, it's a famous Mike Wallace interview where he was saying to Nelson Mandela, you say you're for democracy, but you're talking to Arafat, you're talking to Gaddafi, you're talking to this leader, right? And he says, you assume that your enemies are my enemies. In other words, he was saying, who is really coming to help us? We don't care. It's not so much that it's white face, it's who is really coming to help us to get up under the burden to which we are suffering, not only through our citizenry, but through economics as well. And we talk about the unrest in leadership. You're having a great contention right now with the African leadership because America has now come in on the last boat of trying to do more equitable partnerships with them. There are some countries in Africa where those particular countries cannot even raise the food that they need for their own countrymen, but we export some of their goods to us that they have to have it imported back to them, which is absolutely insane. So there's also a level of trust, and there's a whole new dynamics. And we spoke about Gaza and Israel conflict earlier. Well, the one thing that this conflict always had also revealed, it's almost like you went to Emerald City and that tent was, or that veil was pulled back, that all these unrests now are bubbling up and are exposed to American citizenry. And whether it's the Russian helping them out or China coming to help them out, but China has had a millennial relationship with the region, as we now call the continent of Africa. You can go to some parts of China, if you close your eyes by the sounds of the cockerel bells and the dance and even some of the dialogue, kind of like it's fused with Africa, so what we called Africanness. So again, it's a different region, it's a different idea, but all of it has to do with the lack of support, the lack of resources, the lack of stability.
It's got to be more than that.
Well,
I mean, some of these, as a state, must be held accountable for some of this. Because they have become worse than the colonialists that they fought against.
Well, yes, and there's a form of oppression where you start to take on and mimic the habits of those that have oppressed you. And that's what we see permeating throughout the continent. But let me also frame a little bit of our discussion this way. When we talk about America and looking at China as a strategic competitor, if that's what we want to classify China as, and we can almost mark to the day when we started seeing China's economic rise. And you can almost mark it to the day that they made their first encroachments onto the continent of Africa. When we think back 10, 15 years ago even, the yuan was unstable. There was whole talks of currency manipulation. They didn't know if China's economy was going to remain, whether it was going to be sound, whether it was going to implode. And what did they do? China looked around and they said, oh, where can we go? They went to Africa. And what did they do? They girded up their economy and their currency by getting unfettered access to gold in Africa, unfettered access to silver, unfettered access to all of the strategic minerals and resources. And you can then see China's GDP rising from abysmal levels to 8, 9, 10, 11% GDP growth year over year for almost a decade, but you can almost track it and map it to the day when they started really making their firm encroachments onto the continent. The question that I have is, when is America going to wisen up and likewise follow suit and do the same thing? We just had last week the World Bank group meetings here in Washington, D.C., and most of the world's finance ministers and those that are astute in economics were here discussing these things. And I happen to be part of conversations that took place with several African finance ministers and their central bank governors. And the one thing that I came away with, and this was done with Senator Tim Scott was very instrumental in helping to formulate a discussion around this issue. The one thing I came away from that whole experience with, from the African central bank governors, finance ministers, is that they want to do business with America. But we have fallen so far away from engaging in direct commerce that we come with all of these other ancillary incentives, these other ancillary inducements that they say we don't want any part of that. Now, if you want to talk about trade, you want to talk about forming strategic relationships, we're all for that. But when you want to push some of your social norms onto us, we wholeheartedly reject that. We don't want it. We'll talk to you on fair dealing grounds. We have right now the perfect storm, Mr. Williams. What do I mean by that? I think probably for the first time in history, from a congressional standpoint, we have 4 men that are from the House, U.S. House of Representatives, and the United States Senate, both Republican and Democrat. You have in the House, you have Congressman John James from Michigan. You have Congressman Gregory Meek from New York. They are the chairs of the subcommittee on Africa. In the United States Senate, we have Senator Tim Scott, South Carolina, and we have Senator Cory Booker, New Jersey, both chair and co-chair of the subcommittee policy on Africa. 2 years running now. What have we seen? What have we seen? I tell you what we've seen. We've seen about a week or so ago, H.R. I think 7256, which was a bill introduced in the Africa subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee to basically lambaste South Africa because they are a part of the BRICS nations and are advocating for other countries to come and join BRICS. We literally had our members of Congress sitting there in session berating South African foreign officials who came here to have a discussion with us. And essentially, the legislation actually passed the House. Now, it doesn't have I don't believe that there's a corresponding legislation in the Senate yet, but it passed the House, bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, to essentially call for the President of the United States to unilaterally look at our policy agenda and our relationship with South Africa. This is unheard of. Not that South Africa has done anything to the United States, not that South Africa is a fragile state nation, not that South Africa is harboring and suborning terrorists. No, none of these things. Because they are not walking lockstep with U.S. policy. This is a dangerous precedent to set. A dangerous precedent to set, Mr. Williams.
Will it change?
It could. It should. We again, I go back to, we have the perfect storm right now. We have 4 African American men that are in control of the committees that have jurisdiction over U.S. policy as it pertains to Africa. And then even on the outside of Congress, you have some very sharp people, like you have a Miss Flory Lyser, who is the CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa, and you have many others that are on the outside. But these are people that are...
But can they change the policy?
Yeah, sure they can. They can certainly make recommendations.
Are you hopeful that they will?
No, I'm not, because time is running out.
We'll leave it at that. Marcia, thank you so much, Aaron Manaigo. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. Don't go away.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
And welcome back to the broadcast. From time to time, we go to focus on candidates that are running for seats in the Senate and the House across the country. And tonight, Max Engling is joining us. He's a Republican candidate running in Indiana. Max, what are your thoughts on the political atmosphere? Have you seen anything like this, particularly for someone like yourself who decide that you want to become that public servant that wants to serve Congress? How much has this country has changed, and how much you can do, especially when you see so many members who are freshmen, have been there less than 3 or 4 terms, are resigning. They just don't see the importance of it anymore.
Yes, sir. Well, one, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And you're right. There's a lot of frustration out there right now. When I go around the district, and I'm running for Congress here in Indiana's 5th district, and folks are frustrated. You know, they've got a 20% higher cost of living than 3 years ago. They see what's happening at the southern border. It's wide open. There's crime coming across, illegal migrants. You've seen all that that's happening. And they're frustrated with Washington. And a lot of what they see is just inaction or a focus on things that they're not caring about. And so, you know, you're right. A lot of folks have gone out to Washington and they just get crushed by it. And they say, hey, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. And to me, that's a strategic advantage that I have. So I previously worked in D.C. for a number of years. You know, I grew up, worked, school, lived, kids, and all of that in Indiana. But I spent a few years in Washington where my job was to train members of Congress. And I know what's coming. I've seen it before. I've seen the good parts of Washington and the bad parts of Washington. And so while others may go up there and be surprised at what it is or disappointed or crushed by it, I'm prepared to say, hey, no, let's get to work. Let's actually do what we need to on the conservative side and not just talk about it.
So, would you have supported Speaker Johnson's funding Ukraine?
So I have long said no blank checks to Ukraine. And part of that is because I traveled to the border of Poland and Ukraine a little over a year ago after the war had started. And the 82nd Airborne was handling logistics at the border. And what they said was they would get aid from the United States, they'd get aid from Europe, and then they'd have trucks coming in from Ukraine. They'd put the aid on the trucks, and then they'd wave goodbye to it and say, we hope it gets where it's going. And to me, that's just not good enough. I need to know if you're going to spend taxpayer dollars, that we have to have a strategy. There have to be guidelines in place to make sure that money is being spent appropriately. And we can't be just shoveling money over there in the form of blank checks. So I would not have supported what came up last week in the House. I think I need to see much stronger protections on the front of that.
Even former President Donald Trump has criticized the Supreme Court ruling, the Arizona Supreme Court ruling on abortion. Where is the compromise on this issue?
What I've seen a lot of is we need to build a culture of life in the United States. And, you know, the Supreme Court said this is going back to the people. It goes back, and you can wield that power at the individual level, whether it's with your state representatives or higher. But we need to build a culture of life. And what that says is, like, let's look, for example, at Ashley Hinson's bill, Congresswoman Ashley Hinson in Iowa. She has a piece of legislation that says, how do we look at everything around the issue of abortion? So we use maybe TANF funds. There's $100 million that you can use to say to the father in a situation, you know, let me give you TANF funds, welfare funds, while you're working to keep you in the picture so that the mother in this scenario says, hey, in this economic environment, I can have a child into this scenario. Because we know 61%, somewhere around that number, 60% of abortions come because the mother thinks, I don't have the ability to take care of this child if the child's born. And, you know, also, my wife worked for an adoption agency for 5 years. And they ended up getting to the point where they were turning away adoptive couples because they did not have enough babies in the system because folks were having abortions instead. So we need to build that culture that says, no, we can do this. We need to look at it differently and bigger and say, how do we help the mothers? How do we bear hug these families? And how do we save lives?
What do you do to stop this country from going off the financial cliff?
Man, great question. So there's a couple things to look at when you're talking about the financial cliff. One, you've got the inflation challenge, rising cost of living for people across the country. And on that front, we need to retap American energy. We have to reduce regulations on small and medium-sized businesses. And most importantly, we have to stop spending so much money in Washington. People everywhere can see that, and Washington has to see that. Then the other piece of it is, how do you bring the budget back in alignment? We're looking at almost $35 trillion in debt now. And so, you know, we all know that discretionary spending is just a piece of that. So one, you do have to get that in control. You have to cut waste and abuse. You have to make sure that agencies are in front of the House, that they're being told, hey, if you're going to get this appropriated money, that the Congress has to do its hard work of telling them what to do. But that's just on the discretionary side. Then you have the mandatory side. And so there's another piece of legislation out there by Chairman Cole and by Congressman Jake LaTurner in Kansas that says, when you're looking at something specifically like Social Security, which we know is a huge driver, that in order to save that and strengthen that, you have to do something like put bipartisan members in the same room. It's a commission that they've built for up to a year. And then the answer that they come with out of that commission, it gets a vote up or down on the House and Senate, no amendments. Both parties have skin in the game. Both parties have to understand we have to save and strengthen Social Security. And doing hard things like that is going to help put us on better financial footing for the future.
You know, what do we do about the migrant crisis in this country?
It is absolutely a crisis. You use the perfect word for that. And I've been down to the border a couple of times in the last year, both to Texas and Arizona, and I've seen that firsthand. And in Texas specifically, where it's a water crossing, the cartels will tell folks coming up from Central and South America, and actually around the world at this point, they'll tell them, you stay here on the other side of the river. You can only cross when we tell you from the cartel's perspective. They'll send folks across 400 or 500 at a time. Border Patrol agents will collapse off the rest of the border. They'll apprehend these folks, but then the rest of the border is now wide open. And so that's when they send across fentanyl, crime, human trafficking, folks that are in bonded labor. And so it's an absolute crisis. What we need to do is, one, reduce the incentives or stop the incentives that are drawing people up. Everybody knows now if you come up to the border, you're not going to be turned away. You're going to be processed. You're going to give a ride into the country. You'll be given a hotel stay or some form of stay. And a lot of these blue sanctuary cities, they're going to give you a debit card and say, hey, here's some taxpayer dollars to help you out. And all it is just a pinky swear that you're going to show up to your court date in Milwaukee or wherever it is, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years from now. So you have to stop those incentives to make sure that word goes back. Hey, when you come up to the border, you're going to be turned around. You're not going to be processed into the country. Then you also have to finish building the wall because we absolutely have to have an impediment to help our Border Patrol agents. And the last piece is resource our Border Patrol. Give them the tools and equipment that they need to actually do their work. And it's not what the Senate was saying, where they wanted to send more money down to process migrants faster. I'm talking about resourcing actual Border Patrol so they can do their job of turning folks back.
People say we're also facing a spiritual crisis in our nation.
You are 100% right. And my wife and I, so when we were considering whether, I was going to get into this race, I didn't want to put pressure on her. She didn't want to put pressure on me. So we took a month each separately to say, let's pray about this. Let's think about this individually. And then we're going to come back together and decide if it's right. And we got back together after that month, and both of us felt very strongly, yes, this is what the Lord is having us do at this moment. And when I take my faith, which I take very seriously, in my personal relationship with Jesus, when I look at that and I look out at the country and I say, I see we're so far off of the Judeo-Christian values that built this country. We have to pull ourselves back to that. And you need to be sending out members that understand where their truth comes from. Their truth comes from the Bible. And then they can say, hey, if you have a starting place, let's go and try and pull our country back. And a piece of that, too, is, I have 4 children. We've got an 8, 6, 4, and 1-year-old. And when I look out at the country, there's so many challenges right now and so many challenges that are for the next generation that we just have to get started on these big issues now. We don't have time to waste after this election. We need somebody out in Washington that can get to work immediately. And that's why I'm in this race.
Finally, what's your recommendations about the protests that are just growing on college campuses all across the country?
I think it's the outworking of kind of that TikTok generation. We've seen that people are trending towards this type of mentality because they're reinforced with content on social media, specifically TikTok, which is owned by one of our biggest adversaries. And folks are just not thinking for themselves anymore. They're not critically thinking. Schools are not saying, how do we give you an education that helps you understand what's happening in the world, helps you think critically of what's happening in the world. Instead, it just says, hey, let me tell you what to think. And then they're being indoctrinated with social media and the rest. And then it ends up with these kids that are on college campuses that don't know anything else. They're in their own bubble, and they think that this is an appropriate action because they have never seen anything in real in their life.
Well, let me
and
tell
you wind up with folks like this. Yes, sir.
We wish you well. We appreciate having you on. We'll continue to monitor your race at Indiana. We'll have you back on. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us for tonight's Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams.